What if the most dangerous person in your decision-making life is not a liar, a manipulator, or a bad boss, but the confident little voice in your own head that says, obviously, I know what is going on here? That is the territory of Thinking, Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. This book is not a collection of productivity hacks. It is a guided tour through the machinery of judgment, the mental shortcuts that usually help us, the biases that repeatedly fool us, and the uncomfortable fact that confidence is not the same thing as accuracy. Welcome to this summary of Thinking, Fast and Slow. In this first episode, we begin with Kahneman's central cast of characters, System 1 and System 2. System 1 is fast, automatic, associative, emotional, and effortless. It recognizes faces, reads simple words, detects anger in a voice, completes familiar phrases, and produces immediate impressions. You do not ask it to work. It simply works. It is the mental engine that gives you a world that feels obvious. System 2 is slower, more deliberate, more effortful, and more capable of following rules. It is the system you use when you multiply numbers, compare complex options, fill out a tax form, or force yourself not to say the first sarcastic thing that enters your mind. System 2 can check System 1, but it is lazy in a very human way. It spends effort only when it must, and often accepts the first plausible answer it receives. Kahneman is careful that these are not literal tiny people inside the brain. They're useful labels. The labels let us talk about patterns. System 1 generates impressions and impulses. System 2 endorses, corrects, resists, or rationalizes them. Much of the book studies what happens when System 2 fails to monitor System 1 well enough. The opening promise of the book is a better vocabulary for what Kahneman calls intelligent gossip. He wants readers to notice predictable errors in judgment, especially in other people first, because seeing our own errors is harder. Once the labels exist, we can say, this is anchoring, this is availability, this is overconfidence, this is loss aversion, this is the planning fallacy. The label does not magically make us wise, but it makes the error easier to recognize. Kahneman's collaboration with Amos Tversky sits behind the whole book. Their work began with a deceptively simple question. Are people good intuitive statisticians? The answer became one of the great intellectual shocks of modern psychology. Even sophisticated researchers were often poor intuitive statisticians. They trusted small samples too much. They saw patterns too quickly. They expected evidence to be more stable than it really was. This matters because the human mind is not foolish. Most of the time, intuition works beautifully. We recognize ordinary situations, understand language, move through the world, and make thousands of small decisions without conscious effort. The problem is that the same machinery that makes everyday life possible also creates systematic mistakes in particular conditions. Chapter 1 introduces the characters through tasks that feel easy or hard. If you see a simple equation or a familiar phrase, System 1 handles it. If you are asked to compute something more demanding, your pupils may dilate, your attention narrows, and System 2 comes online. Effort has a feeling. Mental work is not free. Chapter 2 focuses on attention and effort. Kahneman shows that attention is limited. We can do some automatic things together, but demanding tasks interfere with each other. If you're holding a complex number in memory, you become worse at other tasks. If you're deeply focused, you may miss something obvious. The mind has a budget, and effortful control spent from that budget. This is already a practical lesson. Many people talk as if attention were a moral slogan. Just focus. Just think harder. Kahneman makes attention physical and limited. System 2 can do remarkable work, but it tires, narrows, and avoids effort when possible. That is why good judgment cannot depend only on heroic concentration. The relationship between the two systems is cooperative but unequal. System 1 proposes. System 2 disposes when it bothers. Most of the time, System 2 accepts System 1 suggestions. Impressions become beliefs, impulses become voluntary actions, feelings become reasons. This is efficient. It is also risky. The danger is that System 1 is built to make sense, not to be statistically humble. It constructs coherent stories from partial evidence. It jumps from a few cues to a complete interpretation. It often substitutes an easier question for a harder one without asking permission. System may second believe it is in charge while mostly serving as the press secretary for System 1. Kahneman's tone is not anti-intuition. He is not saying that slow thought is always better. In many expert domains, trained intuition can be extraordinary, but he wants readers to respect the boundary conditions. Intuition is strongest in environments with regular patterns and fast feedback. It is much weaker in noisy, low-feedback situations where stories feel clearer than reality. For this first episode, the key takeaway is humility. You are not one clean rational calculator. You are a partnership between fast impression and slow control. The fast system is indispensable, but it is not a truth machine. The slow system can correct it, but it is not always awake. One of the subtle strengths of Kahneman's opening is that he does not ask us to hate System 1. That would be a lazy reading of the book and also slightly impossible, because System 1 is the reason you can understand this sentence without assembling every letter like furniture from a very hostile instruction manual. System 1 is what lets you read faces, catch tone, feel danger, recognize patterns, understand jokes, and move through a familiar room without holding a committee meeting in your head. If System 1 disappeared, life would not become rational. It would become unlivable. The problem is not that fast thinking exists. The problem is that fast thinking often arrives with a feeling of certainty. It gives us impressions already dressed as facts. You see a confident person and feel competence. You hear a fluent explanation and feel truth. You remember a vivid example and feel probability. System 1 does not usually attach a warning label that says, "This is only an impression created from partial evidence. Please consult statistics before making life choices." It simply hands over the answer. System 2, meanwhile, has a strange double role. It is capable of discipline, but it is also responsible for maintaining a flattering story about the self. We like to believe our opinions are the result of reasons. Kahneman shows that reasons are often assembled after an intuitive answer has already appeared. System 2 can be a judge, but it can also become a lawyer. And let us be honest, the lawyer often has a very loyal client. This is why the book's vocabulary matters. Before we have the labels, many mistakes look like personality, intelligence, or common sense. After the labels, we can see mechanisms. The person who is fooled by a vivid anecdote is not simply foolish. They may be relying on availability. The manager who trusts a charismatic interview may be influenced by the halo effect. The investor who tells a beautiful story about a stock may be confusing coherence with evidence. The student who feels sure after rereading a chapter may be mistaking cognitive ease for mastery. Kahneman's purpose is not to make people ashamed of the mind. It is to make the mind less invisible to itself. The word bias can sound insulting, but in this book it is closer to a predictable direction of error. A biased judgment is not always careless. It may be the ordinary output of a system that evolved for speed, coherence, and action rather than statistical precision. The first 2 chapters also make clear why self-improvement is difficult. If the error were simply ignorance, then learning the rule would solve the problem. But many errors happen because the wrong answer feels right. System 2 must notice that a check is needed before it can apply the check. That is the bottleneck. We do not always fail because we lack intelligence. We fail because nothing inside the moment announces, this is the kind of situation where your intuition is likely to betray you. That is why Kahneman's best practical advice often points away from individual willpower and toward better environments. If attention is limited, design processes that protect it. If confidence is unreliable, ask for evidence before hearing the story. If people overread small samples, require base rates. If groups follow the loudest narrative, create space for dissent before the decision hardens. Better judgment is not only a private virtue. It is also an institutional design problem. For a viewer, the immediate application is to notice the feeling of obviousness. Obviousness is not proof. Sometimes the obvious answer is correct, and System 1 deserves a polite thank you. But when the decision is important, expensive, irreversible, or emotionally charged, obviousness should become a signal to slow down. What evidence is missing? What question did I actually answer? What would I think if the same facts were attached to a less likable person? What would the base rate say? This first part of the book is therefore not merely an introduction. It is a change in posture. Kahneman asks us to become less impressed by our own confidence and more interested in the conditions under which confidence was produced. That is not a glamorous habit. It will not make you the most fun person at a party, but it may make you less likely to confuse a good story with a good judgment. Thank you for listening to this first episode. Next, we look at why System 2 is often a lazy controller, and how System 1 builds meaning through association, ease, surprise, and quick causal stories. Final close. The mind feels transparent from the inside, but Kahneman's book begins by showing that much of our thinking happens before we know we are thinking.